It's never going to get easier to choose to still stand with Israel than it is today.
Mm-hmm.
How easy was it to stand with Israel on October 8th? And how easy is it, or not easy at all, is it on March 18th?
Yeah.
The circumstances become more convoluted. The rhetoric is louder. People are angrier about your choice to stand with Israel. It's not going to get easier.
Welcome to A Jew and a Gentile Discuss. I'm your co-host, Carly Berna.
And I'm Ezra Benjamin.
We're a Jew and a Gentile who both believe in Jesus and believe that there's value in looking at history as well as today's world in the headlines through both a Jewish and a Christian lens.
Just a heads up before we dive into our topic today, Carly, A Jew and a Gentile Discuss is listener supported, and we want to give you, our listeners, an opportunity at the end of this program to get more involved. So stay tuned for those details. Let's discuss.
Well, Ezra, we're back for another episode of our Israel series, and this one is a little more close to home. And we're probably both going to tell a little bit of stories as we talk about, everything going on with Israel. What does it mean to stand with Israel? We talk about that all the time. It's not just giving money to Israel, blessing Israel, but to publicly stand with Israel in whatever country that you live in. We live in the U.S., but what does that look like? That's what we're going to be talking about today.
Exactly. And I'm thinking, before we even get into the stories, right? Like October 7th happened, which 165 days ago, to be specific, from the date we're recording this episode. So almost a half a year ago. And that day, even that week, it wasn't taboo to stand with Israel, right? And I'm not talking like from the Jewish community. Yeah. In the Christian community, in like India, we stand with Israel, right? Like regardless of what your faith persuasion was, in response to the horrendous attacks that happened in the land of Israel by Gazan terrorist operatives who were working for Hamas. Either they were part of the formal Hamas structure or they had sort of been recruited out of a hatred for feeling oppressed by Israel, by the Jewish state, right? It wasn't a hard thing to do to say, we stand with Israel. Right. And I think so many governments, some, unfortunately, like Turkey, immediately said, these aren't terrorists, they're freedom fighters, and we do not stand with Israel. We stand against what Israel's done as an aggressor in the region. That was surprising and very unfortunate. But so many states and so many people, right? Israel pride rallies. I went to one here in the Phoenix area, right? There was a heavy security, but thousands of American Jews came out on October 9th, I think it was, or 10th, one or the other, and we're standing in solidarity with Israel, with the Jewish people living in that region. It wasn't taboo, and yet something seems to be changing, doesn't it? It's like it's getting harder and harder to stand with Israel. And you heard about something that happened recently with a friend. Tell us about it. Yeah,
before I even talk about that, we created this shirt that I'm wearing that says, Still standing with Israel, pray for the peace of Jerusalem. And we sold it as a limited time here. And I love this shirt, but sometimes even myself, I think, would I wear this shirt out? Like I do wear it to work and home, but I'm not like in a vast crowd of people.
I wear this in a dark closet. I stand with Israel, right? I know we all, right? But then you're at the cashier at the grocery store wondering if, somebody's going to like deck you in the face because you've got blue and white and a Jewish star on.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's kind of what we'll be talking about today. But the story you're mentioning is a friend of mine who we actually sell these stickers here that say, I stand with Israel or something like that. And she put it on her car like just a month ago. So it's months past October 7th. Yeah. She decided, I have this. I'm going to put it on my car. Right. So her son was driving her car to the grocery store. He was putting his bags in the back of the car, and someone came up to him and just started like berating him, yelling at him, how could you stand with Israel? They're committing all these crimes, they're killing all these people, whatever. Right. And I don't know how this came to his mind, but all he said to them was, I'm Jewish. And he's not Jewish, but that was like his way of protecting himself. And the guy just said, oh, okay. And then he walked away. But like, that makes me think about what if I was in a situation like that? Like, am I putting myself in danger almost by standing with Israel?
Isn't that interesting, right? And so many things, maybe our listeners are shocked at what you said, and maybe they're laughing, maybe they're crying, maybe they're upset. Like, he's not Jewish. Why did he represent that he was a part of the Jewish people? But like, we weren't in that fight or flight situation. Our listeners weren't in it, right? But you have this choice in the moment. Like, this could get super angry. This could get super violent. I want to go home with my groceries before the ice cream melts. Yeah. What do I do here? And so he chooses to identify with the Jewish people, which is so interesting because I'm thinking of other peaks throughout history of anti-Semitism in the world. And actually, during those times, there was tremendous temptation for even Jewish people to say, I mean, I remember I heard stories from my grandmother, like during World War II, parents of Jewish children, Jewish parents would say to their Jewish children, when they ask, say you're a Christian and here's your fake Christian name. Because the idea was the only way out of this was to not identify as Jewish. And even, we did an event to reach the Polish Jewish community with the good news of Yeshua a few holiday seasons ago. And everybody in the room is Catholic, right? Everybody's a Polish Catholic. Why? Because everybody in Poland is Catholic, effectively, right? 90 whatever %. And yet we did this anonymous cell phone survey of the people in the room, festival of Christian and Jewish music, Hanukkah and Christmas together. And we said, who among you has a Jewish heritage? Completely anonymous, 25% of the room, of thousands of people that came. Everybody's Catholic. Yeah. Quote unquote. If you're listening, not watching, I'm doing my big finger quotes now, right? But 25% of the people have a more finger quotes, Jewish background. So what's going on? They stuffed their identity because they knew that it would spell trouble for them. So now in 2024, your friend's son is loading groceries and his only way out of this really, let's say, anti-Zionist, anti-Israel, anti-Semitic experience is to say, I am Jewish. Well, what changed? And I think this is what it is, and this is what we're going to kind of unpack here for a few minutes, is the only socially acceptable reason at this point for standing with Israel and the Jewish people, as the headlines are the way they are today, is to actually be part of the mishpacha, as my grandma would say, right? Part of the family. And it's almost like, if you aren't Jewish, why on earth? How could you possibly justify standing with this aggressive military apartheid presence? I'm, using terms that I don't agree with, but some of the headlines we see in the Middle East, who's attacking innocent civilians in Gaza and Palestine. Right? How could you justify, if you aren't them, how could you stand with them? And that's sort of the environment that we're in now.
It's interesting, though, because now that I think back on it, it was risky. What if the person he was talking to was like super anti-Semitic, and he's like, "Oh, you're Jewish," and then went after him. Like I don't know if that was a voice from the Lord, but oh, you're Jewish, okay, we'll drop it. So either way is a little risky.
It's super risky. It's very interesting to me that he chose to stand. I mean, you hear this is like the Corrie ten Boom of 2024, right? I will identify with these people, if it costs me big time. And I think if it would have been me. You sort of, one, I've got a Star of David around my neck, so it's not something I can hide very well. And I thought about it actually in that, I wore this for years and years before October 7th. But Carly, I remember my first trip to Phoenix Airport, probably like October 20th, okay? First flight. We're traveling all the time. And I'm standing, it's still 260,000 degrees in Phoenix in October, right? So I got like the button unbuttoned and I'm aware that like this necklace, the Star of David, is visible. And I was keenly aware in that moment of the negative reactions I might get. And I thought, like, do I button it up? No. If I'm hiding it during hard times, I shouldn't be wearing it during good times. But it was this whole experience. And then I realized, like, okay, if somebody comes up to me, are you Jewish? Like, probably not going to happen at the Phoenix airport, but stranger things are happening now in the world, right? Certainly some of the places we travel serving scattered Jewish communities and their neighbors, I'm going to own it, and the consequences are going to be what they may. But for Christians, for Gentiles, meaning people not from a Jewish background, who want to stand with Israel, and we're trying to, figure out what that means when push comes to shove, literally, right? Like when somebody's ready to push and shove you over this issue, what are you going to do? And I think a lot of our listeners may even be losing the clarity that we had 165 days ago in the flurry of headlines, in the conflicting information, in the why isn't Israel calling a ceasefire? We just did another episode about that. You should listen to it, right? Like, why is Israel still at it over there? Like, why are innocent people dying? Is it really as many as Hamas say? And all these questions, right? Like, should I stand with Israel, or should I say I stand with Israel and Palestine, and like be right in the middle of the road? And it's just become very confusing.
And I think, of course, there is a fear for anything that we stand for. You could be a believer in Jesus and be persecuted these days.
Right.
But then there is also a faith that God is going to protect you. And then, there's some listening that are saying, oh, Carly, your faith is so small, you don't want to wear that T-shirt.
Right.
But, there's a balance between, putting yourself in harm's way and also having the faith.
Sure. And I think, the T-shirt is a great example because am I doing what I'm doing to make a statement? Maybe I am. Like the Star of David around my neck, the shirt you're wearing, right? Like we're saying, read it and know where I stand, right? At a moment's notice, at a glance, you understand where I stand. And there is an element of bold courage in that. But I think the more important thing that we would encourage our listeners to do right now, beyond making a statement for a snapshot and saying, this is where I am, right? Like my feet are dug in the ground here and you're not going to move me, is actually to do things, behavior, shirts, whatever, necklaces, statements, I don't know, poster boards in the rally that you're standing in. Maybe most of our listeners probably aren't doing that, but maybe you've thought about it on either side of the issue. Yeah. It's less to make a statement and more to start a conversation.
Yeah. And I think if you want to start a conversation, becoming knowledgeable is what's most important. If you come in naively and I just stand with Israel because I stand with Israel, you're not going to get anywhere. Right. Like understanding the issues, having a conversation, that's really what's going to get you somewhere. Right.
And I think sometimes acknowledging the core issues that are fueling the opposing viewpoint helps us stand more confidently in our own. Yeah. So language I like is, this is true and this is also true, right? So like you get into it, you're still standing with Israel after everything they've done?
Right.
And you can, yes, and here's why. Because what's true is I believe Israel has a right to defend its own existence as a democracy in the Middle East.
Yeah.
Okay, they're half disarmed. Well, what about the Palestinians what about the Gazans who have no food and water? What's also true is that this is an extremely difficult humanitarian situation because a terrorist regime is hiding behind its own people.
Right.
And just like acknowledge the complexity, acknowledge the difficulty, acknowledge the degree of human suffering on both sides of the war line related to this situation.
Yeah, definitely. So one question I have for you is, and I don't even want to ask it, but is it going to get worse? Like, will there be even more persecution against both Jews and Christians, probably, alike, or those standing with Israel?
I think that anti-Semitism is real. And what we've seen throughout history is in times of military armament, right? So like things are heating up, wars and rumors of wars, to pull on Jesus' own language about kind of what would be necessary before he would return to rule and reign from Jerusalem. Times of economic uncertainty, times of inter-ethnic strife. Unfortunately, those are the times when anti-Semitism rises. So I do think it's going to get more difficult for that reason alone to stand with Israel.
Yeah.
And then we also see in the scriptures, I mean, these are verses that people either quote like as snippets and move on from, or we don't quote at all because they're not happy. Zechariah 12, Zechariah 14, other sections in the Old Testament prophets say, actually, we quote this verse, all the nations shall be gathered together against Jerusalem. And what it actually says in Zechariah twice in chapter 12 and chapter 14 is that the Lord says, I will gather all the nations together against Jerusalem. So, as there's if Israel is the nation that God's restored, and if the Jewish people are God's chosen people, has God somehow like fallen asleep at the wheel? Like, has he lost control of what's happening in the world if all of a sudden all these nations are gathering together against Israel, against the Jewish people, if it's getting harder to still stand with Israel? And he's saying, no, actually it has to be this way. And we're not on the throne. We're not the judge. We don't have infinite knowledge. Only he does, right? But there's some clear anchors in Scripture where we can see that God's going to get what he's after from Israel and the nations. Because we as a people are spiritually blind to so much of what he wants to do with us, primarily through his son, our Messiah, Yeshua, and we can't see it till we can see it. It has to get difficult to get us to a point where we interact with him out of a place where we're finally willing to listen and to lay down our own stubbornness. And the Scriptures are super clear that nations, this is Matthew 25. If you're going, where are the Scriptures clear on that? Matthew 25. It's this passage about sheep and goats, right? And when I was in prison, you came to visit me. And when I needed a cup of water, you gave it to me. And we've we've relegated that to this kind of help the suffering, kind of humanitarian passage. But what Jesus is actually saying in the original context is that there will come a day when God, the righteous judge, will divide nation from nation over what they did and didn't do with Jewish people in a time of trouble. Mm-hmm. And if you're going, it doesn't say that, go back and look at the context. Don't look at the application. Look at the original interpretation of the passage where Jesus is teaching his disciples shortly before he suffers and dies for the sins of his own people and the sins of the whole world. Mm-hmm. That there's this idea that nations will choose what they're going to do. Right? So I think if all the nations are gathered together, there's also this idea that there's this remnant or this subsegment or subsection of nations who believe in God, right? That they've been reconciled to the God of Israel as Gentiles through Jesus the Messiah. They see in the scriptures what he's doing. They understand that Israel's a chosen people, that though we're faithless, God remains faithful. And they do choose to take that stand and identify with the Jewish people. But it's not happy and it's not easy. And in some cases, we see it whether you want to get into Revelation. I know there's a lot of debate on what's going on in Revelation, but there's a couple passages in Scripture where it's very clear that standing with the Jewish people might even be unto death between now and the return of Jesus, because the stakes are higher, the situation is darker. So the short answer to your question is I do think it's going to get more difficult. I think we see that in the scriptures. We see it in what's happening in the world. And so something we kind of like to say as an appeal, as an exhortation to our listeners so often, Carly, is it's never going to get easier to choose to still stand with Israel than it is today. Mm-hmm. And I think if people go, well, you're exaggerating and you're dramatizing. How easy was it to stand with Israel on October 8th? And how easy is it, or not easy at all, is it on March 18th?
Yeah.
So if we just play that out, the circumstances become more convoluted. The rhetoric is louder. People are angrier about your choice to stand with Israel. It's not going to get easier.
I want to go back to something you just said about standing with Israel could lead to a call to death. Do you think every Christian is called to stand with Israel to the point of death? Like, I'm asking that because some Christians are called to stand on the abortion issue to the point of death, or all sorts of other things. Do you think every Christian, like, listening should be like, oh, wait, is God calling me to stand with Israel until I possibly die for Israel?
Right. What I do think is that I'm not the voice of the Lord, and every Christian's got to ask the Lord for themselves, like, what are you asking me to do on this issue? Yeah. What I also think is that Paul is pretty clear in Romans 9, 10, 11. He's speaking to a predominantly non-Jewish audience, right? The church in Rome, few Jewish believers, mostly Gentiles, who now are part of this family of faith, right? The body of Messiah, who are trying to figure out, like, what's the deal with Israel anyway? They just sort of reject this message, and we received it, so has God rejected them? And Paul says, no, but understand, you've actually been grafted into the faith that was originally and first, not only, but originally and first for the Jewish people. And if you're now part of this olive tree whose roots are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? Like, whose roots are the God of Israel, that, like it or not, understand it or not, you're now in a familial relationship with the Jewish people. And if that's true, if you've been adopted into this family, and if you understand you're in here with some Jewish believers who also have received Jesus and forgiveness for their sins, and you're part of a family of a number of people who rejected that message, and even though they're originally part of the family, have been cut off for a time, then Israel shouldn't be a non-issue for you. Whether that's going to require death or suffering or even knowing a Jewish person. You know, a lot of our listeners may live in parts of the U.S. where they go, I see Jewish people in the Hollywood movies that I'm in, or I hear about them, but I don't have any Jewish friends. But the question is, what's your relationship in a heart level to the people? So that would be my answer.
So we're going to talk basically to a Jewish believer and a Gentile of how, if they should feel afraid to stand with Israel. But I want to start with you as a Jewish believer.
Right.
What would you say to a Jewish believer listening? I know that makes it a little more complicated because you're both Jewish and believe in Jesus, which is its own issue.
Sure. I think, I'll refer to what my late grandma Ruth, may her memory be a blessing, always used to say, and this is sort of the call in every generation for Jewish people: be Jewish, stay Jewish. And others have said the Jewish people are always only one generation away from extinction. And what does that mean? That we're going to reject our Jewish identity and go the other way? No, it means we just sort of hide it. And if we hide it, then we don't have something to pass on to our children, And because we hid it, they don't know it. And if they don't know it, that next generation doesn't have it. And let me be clear, like the Lord in his mercy, it's part of my own story too. Even when Jewish identity is ignored, undervalued, hidden, the Lord can bring that back, but it's not an easy thing. And so I would say, to the Jewish listener, whether they're a believer in Jesus or not, hardship has been part of our story in every generation throughout history. And yet, it's an identity that's God-given. We didn't get to choose it when we were born, so we don't get to dump it when it's inconvenient. And difficult times are maybe the best times for us to say we believe that God exists and that he's actually chosen us to be a blessing to everyone else, even when times are tough, maybe especially when times are tough. So that's what I would say to the Jewish listener. I'm thinking, October 7th happened. It was the end of Sukkot, but then very quickly, with all the anti-Semitism in the world and all the Free Palestine rallies around the world, Hanukkah came up. And Carly, there was this big debate. Like one of the things you do in for Hanukkah in the Jewish community is you light your Hanukkah, right? Your Hanukkah candle stand, and you put it in the window. And the reason we put it in the window was a bold declaration throughout history. This is a Jewish home.
Yeah.
And to my shock, there was this whole debate this past November and December.
To do that or not?
Take your mezuzahs, the portion of the scriptures in the little box on the side of your door. Take them off your house. In America, this is not Iran. This is not Saudi Arabia. In the United States of America, for goodness sake.
People are fearful.
Take the mezuzah off your house. Nobody needs to know you're Jewish. And don't even think about putting your Hanukkah in your window. And I'm going, wait a minute. Is this all it took? Is this all it took for us to stuff our Jewish identity? Or is now the time, not in hubris or hatred, but in confidence in who we are, with a hand of love even extended to our enemy as Jewish believers in Jesus, because that's what he calls us to do and who he calls us to be. Is this not the time to say more boldly than ever, you know what? Am Israel Chai. The people of Israel live. Though we've been attacked, the Lord has sustained us, and we have a responsibility to go be a blessing to everybody else because of the mercy he's shown us. So that's my appeal to the Jewish audience. If all it takes for us to be that one generation from extinction is a little bit of difficulty, then we have problems coming, and we're ignoring the lessons that hundreds of generations before us have learned the hard way.
Yeah. And you can add to this, Ezra, but I would say to the Christian audience, stand with Israel with discernment and knowledge.
Totally.
Like we've been talking about, learn about the issues. Don't just stand ignorantly.
Right.
Be able to have a conversation if someone's going to approach you. But of course, don't put yourself in a situation that, a bunch of aggressors are trying to mob you or something.
Swath yourself in an Israeli flag and run into the London Free Palestine riot. Probably not wise.
Yes.
Not wise. And also, if our audience is listening going, wait a minute, for me to stand with Israel, I'm speaking to a Christian audience now, means I'm not supposed to say anything against the Israeli government. I'm supposed to say Netanyahu is a reincarnation of the Messiah, and the modern state of Israel is God's gift to humanity. No.
Yeah, that's not what we're saying.
It's not whitewashing the humanity and the, in some cases, wrongdoing, right? The Israel military in some cases is screwing up. There's my maybe not so podcast language. Let's say messing up. Okay?
Yeah.
Maybe we'll edit that. Maybe we won't. But you don't have to pretend it's not happening to stand with Israel.
Yeah.
You have to pray all the harder. You have to maybe write a letter to your congressman to challenge some of what the IDF's doing if you don't agree with it. But it doesn't mean to forsake a relationship with Israel and the Jewish people. Israel is going to need friends, and they'll have less and less of them. And when I say Israel, I'm not just talking about the modern state. I'm talking about depending on how you count, 16 to 23 million Jewish people on the face of the earth today. We're going to need friends. And we see in the scriptures that maybe some of our only friends, as we get closer to the return of Yeshua, of Jesus, are our brothers and sisters in the Lord who have been grafted into that tree whose root is faith in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Maybe our only friends at all one day. So challenge the wrongdoing you see happening in Israel, by Israel, with Jewish communities around the world, but still choose to stand. Both of those things can exist.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. We've been talking about standing with Israel to anti-Israel people, but if you have Jewish friends, don't be afraid to tell them that you stand with Israel. That could just spark an entire conversation that maybe you haven't been able to have before.
Right. And it'll open tremendous dialogue to say, I'm not happy or even approving of some of the things Israel's doing, but I'm so thankful the God of Israel reconciled me to himself through Jesus, your Messiah, and I'm choosing to stand with your people, even if it costs me. Like record scratch. That's going to open a conversation that maybe you've never had before with a Jewish friend, family member, colleague, coworker.
Yeah. So in summary, we're encouraging you to have faith, stand with Israel with discernment, with knowledge, and just keep standing with Israel as we've been encouraging on these podcasts.
That's right.
If you benefited from what you heard today and want to benefit others, we support over 80 ministries in Israel right now. And if you do feel led to give in a financial way, 100% of what you give through us goes to those ministries on the ground.
We've just committed an additional $1 million to partner ministries we stand with in Israel this year alone. So if you don't know where to give, we're able to take your gift and get it directly to our ministry partners in Israel. Please go to AJewandAGentileDiscuss.org to give today.
And if you want to hear more episodes, subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcast content. And we'd also love if you leave us a review and share this podcast with someone you know. And if you're not ready to become a supporter today, just let us know that you listen. You can go to our website, AJewandAGentileDiscuss.org, or click in the show notes for more information.
You can also follow us on social media at the handle A Jew and a Gentile Discuss. And if there's anything you want us to discuss or have us answer, please submit your questions at our website, AJewandAGentileDiscuss.org. This is Carly and Ezra. Thanks for listening to A Jew and a Gentile Discuss. Join us next week for another episode. The show is a production of Jewish Voice Ministries International.